So we've got a new setup going on. This is going to be a little temporary just because we've got my Christmas tree over where I usually set up all of my recording stuff. So instead of trying to finagle it like I've done in past years where it's like I literally put the camera in the tree in order to get the perfect angle, I decided I'm just going to move a little bit over so that you've got, my stereo setup here. So that's going to be our backdrop for the next handful of videos and probably even for my, top 10 and top 20 probably of 2023. So yeah, just in case anybody was wondering. But that all taken care of, a little bit of the housekeeping aside, let's dive into today's episode we started off the year with a Riverside album, and it only makes sense to kind of end the year off with a kind of a follow-up to that. So let's dive in. Afraid by Mariusz Duda, and I believe that's how you pronounce his first name. I've been corrected a number of times with it, but I'm going to I think I'm just going to refer to him as Mr. Duda, just so that, we don't trip over our words, shall we say. So Mr. Duda is one of the forerunners of the Polish progressive rock band of Riverside. They put out a fantastic album this year called Identity, and they're kind of like a little bit of a pale in contrast, So Duda was or is one of the lead singers, songwriters, and bass player, I believe, from Riverside. And he's done a lot on his own. I mean, I love his Lunatic Soul project, the project I believe in 2021 or 2020, Through Shaded Woods was one of my favorite albums of that year. And he's also done like a lot of his own solo stuff just with his own name. So with his own solo projects that just have his name, it's a lot more like ambient sound, a lot more experimental noise rock in that sense. And he put out 3 albums last year, all within his kind of lockdown sequences, because you have Claustrophobia, Interior Darwinism, and the Lockdown Spaces, and each one is very noise rock, very experimental music in that sense, very ambient sounds. And Afraid is very similar to that, and if anything, this is almost like a companion piece to the Identity album that Riverside put out. If Identity was very colorful, very multi-chromatic in that sense, there was a lot of different flavors on there was a lot of different textures on it. Afraid is very monochromatic, it's almost monosyllabic in a lot of senses. It's very gradients of different shades of, say, gray in that sense. It's much more in this kind of same kind of identity, if we want to use that, because both have this ID, this artificial intelligence kind of mythos about it, our relationship with technology and where that stands at this point with the ever-shifting landscape and the ever-shifting ideas of what our relationship to technology is, with it being so advanced and whatnot. So Afraid really does kind of paint the more cautionistic tale. So the overall flavor of this album, as I mentioned, is kind of varying gradients of gray in terms of its presentation. It is following suit from a lot of his past works within his own solo works, with it being very experimental, very noise rock, but it isn't into the straight up ambient sounds, where it's very intangible or very ethereal in that sense. This is very concrete, it's very tangible in its presentation. It's not completely way up in the clouds and you're just kind of seeing vignettes here and there. These have very solid and very foundational kind of roots for these tracks to allow the music to kind of develop on its own. And it feels a little bit more like a jam session in that sense for Duda to really blossom and create some really interesting tracks. And I think a lot of this has to do with the rhythm section and the beats that Duda is really laying down. A lot of this is at the heart to kind of provide a through line for a lot of his songs on here. The first couple of tracks, Taming, Nightmares, and Good Morning, Fear-Mongering, it has that kind of very simplistic, almost lo-fi hip-hop beats in it, but providing it as the kind of standard to build everything out. And Duda is kind of very layered in with the textures and the sounds within more of like the synthesizer as being the main music here. And it's reminding me of some of the krautrock that we would have gotten from like Tangerine Dream or Kraftwerk's, the early Kraftwerk's though, the first two records that nobody likes to talk about, in terms of like the layering of sounds, the layering of textures in that. Unfortunately, I do feel even with some of the longer pieces, like the first track of Taming Nightmares and the last track of Embracing the Unknown, there doesn't seem to be like the big crescendo that I'm used to a lot of these more electronic synth-led soundscapes. It just kind of feels like it's more of a wandering of the landscape and just kind of seeing what happens rather than a sketching out to a destination and the buildups that we have towards that. We do get a little bit of that for tracks like Bot's Party, which has a little bit more of a substance to it. There's a little bit more of a driving force towards it, but we never really feel like there's that destination in mind. It just kind of feels like a little bit of a side track for us on this big road trip where the driver doesn't really know where we're going to go, but we're just kind of looking at different landscapes and different soundscapes that we have on there. And at least with Bot's Party, it has a little bit more of a oomph to it. It has a little bit more of a substance to it. At the end of the day, it's the soundscapes that Duda is creating, like Fake Me Deep Murph. Kind of reminds me of Don't Forget Me or Don't Leave Me Murph from Interstellar. It's the soundscapes. It's the utilizing of different noises and synth sounds that really push the music forward. And I love this. This was something that I was hearing a lot earlier this year of using these kind of like not quite MIDI soundscapes, but like the 16-bit, something that we would hear from the Sega Genesis, with like Vector Man or Subterranea that I've already mentioned, I believe, on my Galahad review earlier this week. And the same with I Love to Chat With You, which has, this really heavenly sound to it. You've got these really beautiful layered synths and a little bit of almost sounds like the Mellotron, and you have this vocalization, this robotic vocalization that I really, really enjoy, and it's got this really interesting like texture to it that really helps bloom throughout the whole track. And then you have a little bit of like the darker takes with Why So Serious Cassandra that has this much more like grating sound to it. It's a lot darker. It's a lot more menacing. And then you have this kind of like conglomeration of the two with the journey to mid journey to freedom, which feels like this conglomeration of all the sounds that we've had before. So yeah, in the end, Afraid by Mariusz Duda was a real treat. Like I'm a sucker for this style of music. I love good ambient sounds and good synth-led, synth-wave sounds. It's more of the experimentation, and I love when an artist is able to experiment with sound and textures like this in a style that really helps elevate the musical landscape. It's not just cookie cutter prog or cookie cutter rock. There's a little bit of this experimentation to see where it goes. I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best work that we've had from 2023, but it is one of the more interesting stuff. Like if you're into this more experimental noise rock, then I think you're really going to get a treat out of this. I've been thoroughly enjoying this, and in the end, I will say Afraid by Mariusz Duda is one that I would absolutely pick up in physical format. This one really surprised me, especially with his kind of lockdown trilogy albums, where it was mainly just wandering the landscape without any real perch or any real substance. This had enough substance for me to come back to and for me to really grab onto. I do wish that Duda had incorporated a lot more of his build-ups, payoffs, and crescendos that he was using with the Lunatic Soul project into this, just to provide a little bit more of a little bit of a reward, shall we say. Like I love wandering the landscape, but I always love having a good destination to go to while we're wandering. It does feel like some of those who wander are definitely lost, but being lost in this Afraid landscape isn't necessarily a bad thing. So anyway, those are my thoughts for Afraid by Mariusz Duda. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And that's what I've got. That's what I've got for Afraid. I love that this is kind of like a counterpiece to the ID identity, and it's even kind of spelt the same way because, it's AFR space ID space D, whereas ID identity was ID like little dot and then entity. So yeah, it's a little bit of a call and response in that case. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.